The script I have in front of me calls upon me to extend a warm welcome to this evening's presentation. I'm not sure that we can really have a warm much of anything this week, but certainly we will make the welcome as warm as we can and hope that all of you are happily and comfortably seated in front of your screens. This evening's presentation is entitled Interpreting Historical Landscapes in the Upper Connecticut River Valley and kicks off the 2022 season of history talks sponsored by the Historic Preservation Commission of the town of Rockingham. I'm John Letman and I chair that commission. The speaker this evening is archaeologist Gail Golec, who will discuss historic resources and archaeological sites in the Upper Connecticut River Valley. Often these resources and sites are looked upon as isolated finds rather than a wider community with a shared history. The example that's sort of most obvious to people in the town of Rockingham is the petroglyphs at the falls on the Connecticut River. They've been known about for a couple of hundred years. They've been talked about a lot, but they tend to be seen in isolation. They tend not to have been looked at as part of a range of history, a range of people, and a range of geography. There are various reasons for this, one of which is that due to some circumstances of the way the history of this area went, the first European American settlers along this part of the Connecticut River Valley didn't have a document of acquisition of their territory from the native people, and tended to feel that it just sort of had landed there for them where they had landed here for it. And this has resulted in an erasure of a culture that had been here for millennia. There was no pretense, really, of a transfer of land, as there was in many other places in New England, even though that erasure also happened in greater or lesser degree there. Learning to view geographical landscapes, natural resources, and historical events as interconnected creates a more accurate understanding of our culture and times and better informs us how to preserve and interpret resources. This whole area of interest has taken hold of a lot of interest on our local Historic Preservation Commission, and as the number of people who are present here tonight will tell, it's an interest that lots of us are having, are learning about, are learning a whole new vocabulary for. And I, for one, find this quite exciting, and I think the rest of you do too. Gail Golec is a professional archaeologist who has practiced in our region for over 20 years, working on sites primarily in New Hampshire and Vermont. She was born and raised in the area and has undertaken extensive research projects focusing on the contact period, early colonial settlement in the 18th and 19th century. She's looked at cemeteries and documented the lives of indigenous and African-American community members of the Greater Falls and Monadnock region. Gail Golec teaches classes on these topics, gives community lectures, and writes and produces a podcast about historic cemeteries called The Secret Life of Death. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. To avoid background noise, please keep yourself muted. At the end of her talk, we'll have time for questions, and we certainly expect there'll be some robust conversation. Please be aware that this evening's presentation is being recorded, as you will notice on your screen, and will be available through YouTube. I'd like to acknowledge our ongoing and wonderful partnership with the Rockingham Free Public Library. Particularly thank librarians Ann Dempsey and Sam Maskell for their ongoing help with the History Talks 2022 series, which is made possible in part through funding from the Vermont Division for Historic Preservation and the National Park Service. Now, please join me in welcoming Gail Golec.
All right, I'm gonna try to do the screen share thing and see if that works. Is that, let me scooch this. Do we have a slideshow showing up for everybody? You're good? All right, excellent. I'm just gonna scooch my tabs out of the way so I can see what I'm doing. There we go. Okay, all right. So thank you everybody so much for coming in or out tonight. I'm not sure what to call it, but for the presentation here, the Interpreting Historic Landscapes, Understanding Historic Resources and Archaeological Sites in the Upper Connecticut River Valley. And especially thank you so much to John Letman for the wonderful introduction, and to Walter Wallace and the Rockingham Historic Preservation Commission and the Rockingham Free Public Library and Ann Dempsey for inviting me to present this evening and for hosting this talk. I had to cut out all of my intro stuff because we've already got my credentials out of the way, so you're up to speed on that. So you know what I'm all about. So I'll just get on with the presentation as it is. So on with the show, or on with this show anyway. And as John Letman alluded to in the introduction, recently here in the Upper Connecticut River Valley, there have been a couple of high-profile historic building removals that have captured the public's attention. And in the aftermath of the demolition of the Robertson Paper Mill and the Methodist Church in Bellows Falls, I think I, like so many of you, probably had this thought of, geez, how did we let such important historic buildings get away from us? And I think if there's anything good that's come out of those losses, it's that it's inspired some people to start to get more active in preservation, inspired other people to become active in the process for the very first time. And for those of us who are in the business of historic preservation, it's gotten us to think, well, now that we have this public interest, how do we affect change on our historic resources? How do we, so that the losses like the Robertson and the Methodist Church don't happen again? How do we do historic preservation better? And so part of that answer, I think, going forward is that we need to do things differently. That's sort of the short answer. And part of doing things differently in historic preservation is to start to think about history differently. Generally, historic sites and archaeological sites are talked about and presented to us as isolated finds. We have a building, a cemetery, a habitation site. And they're often used in these contexts to represent a fixed point in time in history. And there's certainly nothing wrong with that view, and there is definitely a place for those kinds of designations. But I find that kind of limiting. And for example, let's think, if I told you to close your eyes and picture something from the history of Bellows Falls, I bet most of us would come up with an image like this, right? So this photo that we're looking at here, of course, is of the gigantic paper mill complex that was out on the island as it looked around 1915. And this view that we're looking at is of Bellows Falls. We're looking west across the Connecticut River from the New Hampshire side, somewhere from up on the side of Fall Mountain. And this image in particular is very emblematic of what Bellows Falls is known for, and even known as. And though this particular version of Bellows Falls hasn't existed for over 100 years, the mills are still a huge part of how this place identifies itself. But interestingly enough, 100 years before this photo was taken, this is also Bellows Falls. So this is a watercolor done by an unknown artist that shows Bellows Falls Village, but specifically the island area of Bellows Falls around 1905 or 1805 rather, excuse me. And the view from this is somewhere from up on Rockingham Street or a little bit higher up, looking east across the Connecticut River into New Hampshire. And that big mountain in the background that you see is Fall Mountain. So in 1805, this place was this bucolic little village with this little farms and fields and all these cute little fluffy sheep out in front. It's adorable, really. But just think about the difference of the lifestyles of what's happening here in Bellows Falls in 1805 and what's happening 100 years later from that picture that we saw of the mills from 1915. This is exactly the same spot, but at a different point in history, this place looks very different. But Bellows Falls has been many things throughout its history. Prior to the 1870s, it was a tourist destination. This particular image is an 1834 etching by artist Lucy Weber, and it's a view of the falls from the south down right along the Connecticut River looking north, and you've got Fall Mountain there on the right-hand side. And this image is interesting because it's highlighting the area's natural beauty. This is, quite a fantastic landscape to look at, because prior to the development of this place as a railroad hub and mill town, the village was a celebrated destination for artists and theologians and naturalists. They were all drawn here by the natural beauty of the river and the falls and the mountain as far back as the 1790s. And actually in 1856, author and naturalist Henry David Thoreau came to the village sightseeing, and he even climbed Fall Mountain. So from this specific example, we can see that Bellows Falls, like any place, when studied at a single point in history, an historic snapshot, if you will, can be one thing. It's an enormous, sprawling brick mill town, for instance. But when it's studied at another snapshot point in history, it was something completely different, this tiny little pastoral farming village. Now, both of these snapshot versions are equally true and equally real, but these versions are not equally represented in our historical narratives. Why is it that when we think of Bellows Falls history, our minds automatically go to that 1915 version of the town and not the sleepy little village or an artist's haven? So there's a disconnect there. So what if we viewed our history more as it actually functions? What if instead of talking about history as a series of start and stop dates, or by focusing on one specific place at a static point in time, we see the continuity of people and places across time? What if we begin to assess history as the entirety of interactions of people with their physical environment, factoring in how people and land change over time? Going beyond just looking at the historic records or existing buildings, and including all sorts of areas of study like ethnography, oral histories, genealogy, geology, and archaeology. And this is what I'm talking about when this is what I mean when I'm talking about historic landscapes. So thinking back to that Bellows Falls Mill example again, by just focusing on this very brief 60-year period of Bellows Falls history out of the entire 13,000 years of human history of this place, just imagine how much of the story we end up missing. So let's start let's start by discussing how local landscapes have changed over time and how those changes affect how and where human history shows up on the land. So at the end of the last ice age, about 17,500 years ago, the Connecticut River Valley was filled with a massive glacial meltwater lake that today we call Lake Hitchcock. So in this graphic shows the maximum extent of the lake waters right before the lake began to drain away. So this shows us the whole river valley in and around Bellows Falls. We've got Fall Mountain. They're surrounded on all sides. It's kind of an island right there. We can see how the whole valley is filled up with water, the blue that I've colored in there, and how far up into the peripheral tributaries and other smaller stream beds that the water reached up into. But over 4,000 years, roughly, the water levels of the lake would drop. They'd level off for a while. So the lake waters have dropped a little bit here. We can see that some of the more area is exposed. Fall Mountain is no longer an island, and some of these side channels or smaller tributaries are no longer underwater. It drops again, revealing each time a little more land as the waters go down, until finally, by about 13,000 years before present, it reaches the present configuration and becomes the drainage for the Connecticut River Valley. So as the physical landscape changes over time, they present different ecological environments and natural resources, which in turn affect how humans interact with this landscape, which in turn affects where we find the evidence of that human occupation. And it's among these earliest post-glacial environments that we find the earliest indigenous Native American sites in this area. So let's talk about indigenous landscapes first. So just to start off, I just want to say that I am an archaeologist. I'm an historian. I dig holes and I write reports and I read books about the history of this area. I am not an indigenous person, and I can't and should not speak to what it is to be indigenous. So in the spirit of trying to do things differently in historic preservation, I am going to read a statement that's been provided to me by Elnu Abenaki members Rich Holshoe and Chief Roger Longtoe Sheehan about what history and connection to their historic landscapes means to the Elnu Abenaki and their people. So I'm just going to take a sip of water first. Indigenous people are, by dictionary and self-definition, the original people of a place. To that degree, they are one and the same. The people are the land, and the land is the people. The indigenous people of the mid-Connecticut River Valley are the Sokoke Abenaki, a part of the larger group of Wabanaki nations. They and their ancestors have been here for 12,000 years, and they continue today. The Abenaki know this place as the Dawn Land, spoken in their language as Wabanaki. You can see that these represent the same concept. They are each other. The land provides the context by which one can see oneself in the vast circle of creation. We see ourselves in terms of the embedded and embodied shared spirit that persists here, even as it changes shape over time. Further, the Abenaki are riverine people, always oriented to the connected flows of certain waters through the land. Each group references their homelands in terms of watershed, from headwaters to confluence. This too manifests in the Western Abenaki language, since culture's language encodes their worldview. In that, an Abenaki person will refer to their place in this land as Nsibu, my river. These fluid connections run deep and strong and give credence to the expression, water is life. It follows that in certain places where worlds converge and spirit is strong, such as at Kitsipontuk, pardon me if I butchered that, Kitsipontuk, the Great River, the Great Falls, now called Bellows Falls, these connections are even more apparent. So this concept, this idea of historic landscapes, this approach that we're talking about here today actually takes a lot of its cues from how Indigenous people view their relationship to history and their landscape. And as the first and continued stewards of this land here in the Connecticut River Valley, understanding how Indigenous people utilized the land, we find where their sites are, why their sites are there in those places. It'll help us appreciate how much can be gained by this more expansive and inclusive approach to history. For the modern and ancestral Indigenous people in the Connecticut River Valley, their history has always been about continuity and connections. Continuity as they have lived here since the beginning of time. Archaeologically, we have evidence going back 12,500 years before present in the Connecticut River Valley. And connections to their landscape, to their ecological systems, to their waterways, and to each other. Understanding the connections and continuity of historic landscapes will help us interpret historic and archaeological sites of all kinds. So let's look at that, go back to the geology for a little bit and talk about that in terms of historic landscapes. So this photo is of a modern glacial outwash plain in Greenland. And it's actually very similar to what the river valley environments of the Connecticut and Ashwellet rivers would have looked like right after the glaciers retreated. And so notice the wide open sandy plains of all of these meltwater streams and rivers that are here. At this time, this area, like Greenland is now, was a steppe tundra ecosystem. So there aren't going to be very many trees, if any, and it's going to be frozen most of the entire year except for at the very height of summer. And so on the left-hand side here, we have a topo map of the greater Keene area. And you can see that the city of Keene is situated right in the middle of a very wide open river basin. And this is the same kind of sandy open area that we were just looking at in Greenland. At the end of the last ice age, the Northeast was an open steppe tundra, just like Greenland. And so that's a very different environment from what we have today, which is a deciduous temperate climate right now. But we know from a couple of archaeological sites from the Ashwellet Basin that people were living here in that steppe tundra 12,500 years ago. So on the right-hand side, we have a picture of an extensive archaeological excavation I was involved with at the Tennant Swamp site in Keene in 2010 while working for Monadnock Archaeological Consulting. So 12,500 years ago, that's the date of this site, the Paleo-Indian people were living here and making use of this seemingly inhospitable, freezing cold steppe tundra. They were able to survive and thrive in this cold and arid environment by following migratory caribou herds that lived there in the steppe. The Paleo-Indians traveled in these small family units of about 20 people or so, and they stayed incredibly mobile. They'd only stay in a spot for a week or two, or possibly at the most a month. And because of that, these types of sites are very small and leave a very light imprint on the ground. So if we're talking about small sites that leave a very light imprint on the ground, how do we even find them? Well, it helps for us to consider a different historic landscape, one that thinks about this area not how it is utilized today, not how it looks today, but how it was, and how it was 13,000 years ago, and where all of the resources were distributed back at that time, not today. And we need to forget about all the trees we see in the background of this shot, because as I said, the steppe tundra doesn't have any trees. And we need to forget about where the river drainage is now, and where the especially the Ashwellet River is now, because that has changed over time too. We have to start thinking about this landscape in terms of what would the best vantage points have been 12,500 years ago. What would the best and most logical travel routes have been 12,500 years ago? And where were the available natural resources 12,500 years ago? So imagining these ancient landscapes and by searching those criteria that I just talked about, that's how we were able to come across and find this Tennant Swamp site in Keene. But the big thing about historic landscapes, of course, is that they do change. They change over time, right? And so by 8,000 years before present, our climate in the Northeast had started to warm, and it became temperate and forested, pretty much like what we have today. There were 4 seasons. And because of that, that impacted what kinds of food and water sources were available at what times of the year. So the indigenous people of the Northeast, the descendants of the Paleo Indians who were at the Tennant Swamp site, adapted to that change in environment. They were still hunters and gatherers, but they followed the seasonality patterns across the landscape, and followed available food sources as they became available at different times of year. For example, in this slide here, on the left-hand side, we have the topographic map of what is the southeast corner of New Hampshire at around Mount Monadnock. You'll see that at the bottom of the map. And you'll notice that this is very hilly. We're away from the river valley of the Connecticut River. We're in the upland areas of the Monadnock region here. And this is full of little rivers and lakes and wetlands. So this is a very different environment than being down in the big Connecticut River Valley drainage. And so these places were very attractive, not only because for indigenous people, not only because they were full of food, but because the availability of that food was very predictable. Fish spawn at certain times of the year in the summer. Every summer, you'll have ducks and other migratory birds that come back to these water sources, the same ones every year. And then you have animals like turtles, who are hibernating for part of the year, but then come out and are living on land for part of the year as well. And that kind of knowledge about what kind of food sources are being utilized, this is the kind of stuff that shows up in the archaeological record. On the right-hand side, we have a photo of some burned turtle shell that came from a fire pit excavated from an indigenous site in this region around one of these lakes in southeast New Hampshire. So again, to find really old indigenous sites like this, it helps to imagine a completely different historic landscape than what we're looking at presently. One that makes regional connections between land, between seasonal food sources, and in this case, it's a little bit different because we're dealing with a different type of climate than we were in the Tennant Swamp site example. And so touching on this example touches on another kind of historic landscape that I think we need to consider, especially when imagining indigenous sites. We're talking a lot about waterways, and because waterways are how indigenous people connected pretty much to everything and each other. And As indicated by the Elnu Abenaki members, Rich Holshoe and Chief Roger Long Toshihan in the beginning, when I read that introduction about waterways, they consider waterways are not just food sources, they're not just sources of fresh water or even travel routes, they're all those things, but they're also ways of connection, and particularly watersheds are ways of connection. And what I mean by watershed is we're talking about the total land surface area that drains into one water course or water body. So a lot of these, this concept of the reach of watersheds serves as an important backdrop for many personal and spiritual connections for Indigenous people. So here we've got a map of New England, and we're looking at the Connecticut River Valley drainage here, the Connecticut River Valley watershed. And so all of these areas in the dark green are part of the Connecticut River Valley watershed. All of this land that you're looking at in the green, all of that land surface drains its surface water downhill and eventually reaches the Connecticut River Valley. All of the smaller tributaries, you can see some of them outlined in blue here, all of those feed into the Connecticut River Valley. And so if you think about it, this area in dark green is kind of the reach of the Connecticut River, if you will. So prior to the arrival of the Europeans, there really weren't the political boundaries that we know today. And since water is how Native American people traveled, the reach of their kinship groups also mirrored the reach of these watersheds. So if we think about the picture that or the map that I had on the last slide, that big outlined dark green area, all of that would be considered sort of kinship territory. They are related to the people in these areas that this watershed reaches into, because you can travel to these people and meet them by following these watersheds or these different drainages into the same watershed. So because of that, waterways have incredible social and cultural significance because they even served as landmarks for a lot of oral tribal histories. And so as I said, these were the ways that they made connections to each other. They could actually physically travel these routes along the rivers and meet up with other people that they were probably related to, most likely. And this is a great example of an historic landscape, these ideas of watersheds in Indigenous culture. And it's one that's based on the use of a resource across the land over time. And the way we think about, and it's a way of thinking about history that's very different, I think, from our Euro-American worldview, but it's every bit as valid. And speaking of the Euro-American worldview, let's take a look at their relationship to the land and how their background and attitudes affect what we might look for in discovering their historic landscapes of Euro-Americans. So remember, we're still talking about the same physical environments that the Native American people lived in, but a different historic landscape. The Europeans, particularly the English, had less of the light touch, reciprocal kind of relationship that the Native Americans had with their land. And they had more of a concentration on permanence and ownership of land. You build a house on the land, you cut down the trees, you plant crops, build roads, you make settlements. That's what their main concerns were. They established political boundaries that delineated control of natural resources. And this map that we're looking at here is from 1850. And I really like this map because it's a perfect representation of that English mindset that I was just talking about. It's covered with boundaries and labels, and it shows you the extent to which, at least in 1750, that in New England, where the English settlements had reached to date. So you can see that they're primarily situated in southern New England, scrunched up along the coasts, and they haven't quite made it into Vermont and northern New Hampshire yet. And at this time, of course, the success for an Englishman is literally measured by how much land you can, quote, improve. And by improve, they meant clearing the trees, planting crops, and settling it, producing a commodity that you could sell in the name of the king. And this English pattern of land use and settlement leaves a much bigger footprint. And imagining their historic landscape, an historic landscape based on this model, is a little easier for us because, after all, the modern world we're living in is really an outgrowth of that historic landscape. So to understand the evolution, particularly here in New England, of the Euro-American settlements up here in the Connecticut River Valley, we need to reconstruct their historic landscape. So first, it helps to know that these settlements generally followed a pattern. The earliest Euro-American towns in this area, we're talking pre-1760s, were centered around military forts and garrisons. And since rivers were the main source of travel, all of these early settlements are going to be situated along the major rivers of the area. After the 1760s, the English start moving away from those early river settlements into the upland areas. In the beginning, they set up the first homesteads at the height of land, the highest spot in a town, and they would later be known as hilltop settlements. This etching that we're looking at here shows us what a typical Euro-American homestead would have looked like in the 1760s. We can get a real sense of the historic landscape that we've been talking about. This is a very small one-roomed cabin, a log cabin. It's set in a very small clearing. There looks like there's a couple that's living there. Maybe they've got a couple kids running around. There's a few sheep, a few cattle, but there's no real infrastructure other than this particular house. There's no roads, there's no bridges, there's no neighbors nearby. And so there's not much but woods all around them, quite literally. So you can get this real sense here that people at this time were very isolated. A little bit later, here we have, we'll say it's about 20, maybe 20 or 30 years later, the 1790s. We have our same cabin in the same area that we were looking at before, but it's got some additions. There's been some changes. There's fencing that's been put up. There's a few more animals. We got some pigs sitting there in the front yard. And there's definitely more people because we can see a big group out in the back working to clear a much larger field. The house is still small, but it's got a new roof and there's a nice little garden off to the side. And there's also a little bit of upgrades. There's some rudimentary bridging going across that brook there, and a little more infrastructure, and definitely a few more people, but it's still pretty, it's still pretty rural and still pretty isolated. So then we start, by the 1820s, we start to see a lot more changes. So at this point in this part of New England, towns are expanding their infrastructure quite rapidly. And they begin actually setting up mill villages in most of the towns. And these were special settlements that were set up on rivers or large brooks, and they were designed to build a lot of mills that would harness the water power in the town. And so we sort of have that view set up here with our cabin. There has been some major upgrades of what we're looking at with our old cabin here. The widespread field clearing out behind the house. There's a lot of land cultivation underway. Mature orchards. There's been orchards planted next to the house. We have a good sized barn finally on the property, and the little cabin has an addition onto it. New roofing, new siding, and there's neighbors. There's another house way out beyond the edge of the field there. And the fencing is kind of snazzed up, and there's a much nicer bridge crossing the brook there. And as I said, towns are starting to develop mill villages, and there's a little mill shown up kind of hidden in the woods up here on the brook in this example too. And so by the time we reach the 1850s, most of the land in New England, certainly in this area of the Connecticut River Valley, has been cleared away and turned over to cultivation. Our little cabin that we started out with has turned into this big old fancy pants, elegant home. The landscape around the house has changed dramatically too. All of the trees have been cut pretty much for as far as the eye can see, and it's been turned over into cultivated fields. They've even built some stone walls, delineating some of the boundaries of the fields. A railroad now runs off in the distance here in the back. There's a little railroad that comes through. And off in the distance behind the railroad, we actually see a village that's been established on the right-hand side. It's got a church, it's got a cemetery, and even looks like there's a downtown set up there. And of course, the house is pretty much unrecognizable from what we started out with, that little one-room cabin. There's extensive outbuildings and all sorts of additions and barns. And there's a nice stone arched bridge off to the side. And of course, the mills on the river, or on the brook here in the river, have been greatly expanded too. So the whole area by 1850 has opened up quite a bit. And so if we think about where we started in the 1760s to about here 100 years later, that's a pretty dramatic change in the landscape of New England. So I pulled up here a map of the town of Alstead, New Hampshire. It's an 1858 map. And I like this one because it's a really good example of how a typical New England town in the Connecticut River Valley was laid out at the mid-19th century. This town at this point has individual villages that we can see. There's Alstead Center here. This would have been the original hilltop settlement of the town, and it becomes known as the center. There's a smaller, not smaller, but a slightly younger settlement called East Alstead off to the right-hand side. And they've got a mill village, paper mill village, which was established up here in the 1820s. As its name indicates, it was set up to make some of the earliest paper in the region. And so it sort of checks off all the boxes of what we were talking about in our other example of the progression, the evolution of New England villages and towns in the early 1800s. We can see there are all sorts of roads and all sorts of people living out here on those roads. There's mills and municipal entities here in this town. But the one thing that this town doesn't have, that we don't see on this 1858 map, is direct access to a railroad. And that, among other things, is going to have a huge effect on Alstead and other towns like it in the region as time goes on. So the population within rural New England towns generally was on the uptick up until the 1860s. And although it tended as little as other villages, as they started to establish those mill villages here and there, the populations would move around and redistribute themselves, but they generally tended to be pretty stable or even grow up until the 1860s. After the 1860s, after the Civil War, after the Industrial Revolution, the opening of the American West, there is a mass exodus of population from New England to those areas. They're moving to cities to work in good paying mill jobs. They're moving out west to get their hands on some of that amazing flat, wonderful farmland that exists out there that does not exist in New England. And so by the time the 20th century rolls around, the populations of rural New England towns had really shrunk significantly, and some had shriveled up altogether, resulting in properties being abandoned. Fields were left fallow, and many roads were no longer maintained after a certain point, and you'd even have cemeteries that were abandoned and overgrown. As anyone who had ever known the people who were interred there had moved away, had moved out west, or were even dead themselves. So this idea of abandoned farms and depressed little rural New England towns is pretty grim, but it's actually a really important part of the historic landscape of New England. Because by understanding how that depopulation happened, why it happened, and how it played out in our towns, we can then use that to help reconstruct the landscape that used to be here. Now you might be thinking, well, if all of the houses are gone and all the fields are grown up, how do we figure out what a historic landscape used to look like? Well, even though things may not look the same today as they did 100 years ago, or even as they did in the 1850s, there are still going to be scraps of evidence left out there. There are going to be clues about this historic landscape. And chances are, I can almost guarantee you've all seen examples of some of these clues out and about in New England. Stone walls. If you've been anywhere in New England, you've seen a stone wall for sure. By the 1850s, remember, we're talking about all those open areas and all those trees cut down and fields turned into cultivation. Well, they were starting to take some of those rocks that were coming out of the fields and do something with them. They lined their fields with them. They lined their roads with them and delineated property boundaries with them and field boundaries. And so anytime we see a stone wall, that is a big fat clue that tells us at some point, probably from the early to mid 1800s, somebody was doing something on this particular piece of property. So what I tell people is, well, follow the stone walls. Literally, you follow the stone walls and see where they take you, see where they intersect one another, because that's going to give you ideas about property boundaries or even field boundaries as well. And if you follow one long enough, it's probably going to take you to one of these, a stone building foundation. This is another great visual clue that still exists out there in the woods all around us. Oftentimes, all that remains of a home or a mill or a barn is this old stone foundation here. And once you find one of these in an area, start looking around where you are, because generally you're going to find other stone foundations in and around the other ones. And you'll find, they'd be old barns or outbuildings, and probably you'll find a lot more stone walls. And once you've gotten to the point of identifying the presence of old walls and old foundations, I suggest that we start consulting old maps. These are the best thing in the world. Historic maps are fantastic. I love them. So in this here, these 19th century maps are wonderful because they're just cool. But they also, this one in particular, these ones from the 1850s, and there are a couple like this that they made in the 1850s and 60s and 70s that have labels of the people's names for each house. So you can find out, possibly in 1858, if you found a house foundation, you can find out who owned it in 1858. That's going to be another great clue for you to start working off of to figure out who lived in this landscape back then. And so the other thing, this is a map of Westminster, Vermont. And I like this one because it shows a lot of, you can see where all the roads go too, which is also is going to be another great clue for us to help reconstruct some of these old historic landscapes. We find out how this place used to look back in 1858, where roads used to go and where people used to live. And of course, if you want to know more about where people lived, you look at where they died or where they're buried anyway. And it's clear from this example, this is from the Rockingham Meeting House, that of course people lived here. This cemetery is located right in the middle of the village of Rockingham. It's behind this very nice, very beautifully maintained historic building, the Meeting House right there on the right-hand side. And so when we look at this, and think of the historic landscape that this cemetery is in, it makes perfect sense where we find it. We find it in a village around buildings, historic buildings that are even being used today. It makes sense when we find a cemetery right next to a village that's being used and taken care of and functional, it makes sense that, and obviously this is a site when we see something that looks like this. But what about this cemetery? This is the Michael Gilson Cemetery in Westminster, Vermont. And this presents very differently from what we saw at the Rockingham Meeting House. Very different landscape, very different layout. And it's clearly in the woods and not out in the open. There's no village nearby the Michael Gilson Cemetery. There aren't any historic buildings around it. There isn't even a road that goes by it. As you can see, this is a pretty good sized cemetery. There are a lot of people, a lot of families represented here. So there were people here, but the clues that we normally might look to help us identify a potential site, the building, the roads, old stone walls even, none of that seems to be lining up in this particular situation. So we don't see old buildings, we don't see old foundations here, but we go back to the maps. We gotta love the maps, they're great. Maps are wonderful because they present us a lot of information, a lot of visual information in a visual way, very concisely, and they'd help us tell a great story. And they're really good at filling in missing pieces of puzzles, history puzzles. And so that's why it's a really good example here at the Gilson Cemetery to help put that story back together. So this is again the same 1858 map of Westminster that I showed you a few minutes ago. And I've zoomed in on the location of the Gilson Cemetery. I've circled it in the red right there. And we're at the far southeast corner of town. And looking at this in the 1858 view, far from being an isolated spot out in the woods that it is today, we see that in 1858, the Gilson Cemetery was situated between a number of roads, and it's actually plopped right into the middle of a very populated area. If we cross the town line over into Putney here, we can see a number of families that lived out there. And when we cross-check these names of the families that show up on the map here with who is in the Gilson Cemetery, we see a lot of overlap. This is the same families that are showing up in there. There are the Gilsons and Pages and Sabins and Floyds all here, all in this neighborhood, all show up in the Gilson Cemetery. And so if we do a little genealogical research, it's going to show us that a lot of these families were interrelated. They intermarried one another. And so things are starting to make a little more sense when we turn back roll the clock back a little bit and see what was going on in and around this cemetery 150 years ago. So when we taken out of context, taken out of its historic landscape, if you will, it doesn't make much sense what we see at the Gilson Cemetery. But when we see that it's part of this little neighborhood, in and among all of these interconnected families in the center, pretty much in the center of this neighborhood, we really have a much better understanding of its historic landscape in its time. And so then seeing that Gilson Cemetery there makes perfect sense to us when we see it in the proper context like this. So what happened in the intervening years? What happened between 1858 to today that explains the disparity in how it looks today versus the very clearly highly populated area that it was once part of. We can see here, this is a map, topographic map from 1927. This is some 70 years after that map we just looked at. And we see that Gilson neighborhood that I was talking about is pretty much gone. There are hardly any houses in this little area. The circle here is where the cemetery is. And if there's a few little black dots here and there, but all of those houses, there are hardly any of them left at this point. And there have been some changes in the road configuration too, you'll notice. Route 5 is still there. That's still the same road that had been there. But The two little roads that once went around the Gilson Cemetery, they have been discontinued at this point, apparently, from this map. And the final clue here is that the cemetery itself isn't actually even labeled on this map, which tells us that by 1927, it was not active and was probably not being well cared for. The fact that the map maker didn't even know that it was there. So that gives you a little bit of a clue as to how that breakdown came out. So going through these examples, and especially with that Gilson Cemetery, we can see that trying to interpret the story of the Gilson Cemetery, just based on how it looks today, leaves these enormous gaping holes in its history. And it's only when we contextualize that site in its time, when it showed up on the 1858 map, and expand the research to not just include the here and now, but the before and after, do we really get the history, the full breadth of the history of that site fully represented? And do we really understand or begin to understand what the life was like in and around that Gilson neighborhood at that time? And that's just one example. Some of the other sites that we've talked about tonight, I think you can say the same thing about them, that taken at any one particular point in history, sort of like the overarching theme of the night, tells you one story. If you look at it at another point in history, it tells you a very different story. And it's kind of humbling how much we miss, though, simply because we don't know what we don't know when we're starting to reconstruct these histories. We're just unaware of all the little things in between. And it's not until we start looking at these sites in that more expansive historic landscape approach that we really get the full depth and breadth of history and a more accurate narrative about the history. And so hopefully starting to think about historic landscapes will encourage us to go beyond just a name and a date and start developing those complete narratives for our history. Because those narratives, a narrative that starts to include more perspectives, and that's going to in turn help us preserve more history. So that's what I have for this evening. I just want to thank special thanks out to Ann Dempsey at the Rockingham Library again for inviting me to speak and for handling all the invitations and running the show, getting people signed up and getting people emails and the connection to the Zoom tonight. And thank you to Walter Wallace and John Letman and the Rockingham Historic Preservation Commission for also inviting me to speak and giving me the venue tonight. And a special thanks to Rich Holshoe and Chief Roger Longtoe Sheehan of the El New Abenaki for providing me with the statement about regarding the tribes' feelings about their historic landscapes. And it's been a lot of fun to put this together and present this tonight. It's kind of hard because we're used to doing these in public. I get no feedback, so sort of just feel like I'm talking to myself out there sometimes, but it's still fun. I like talking to myself, I guess, but it's fun, and I'd be happy to stick around and answer questions throughout the evening. And as before I go, I'm going to shamelessly plug my podcast. I have a history podcast. You'll see the graphic there screaming at you on the screen there. It's called The Secret Life of Death, and it's primarily about historic cemeteries. But again, in the theme of the evening of talking about historic landscapes, it's way more than just that. I expand the history to talk about both sides, the before and the after and the everything in between. And it's all about local history and local sites, local cemeteries, local people. And you can find the recordings at either my website, which is thesecretlifeofdeath.com. All the episodes are available there. Or if you have a podcast platform that you like, it's available on all the major podcast platforms out there. And it's fun. It's the kind of thing you like if you like that kind of thing. So thanks a lot. And so yeah, we'll do questions if anybody's got any.
Well, Gail, I see on the chat a number of folks offering thanks for a wonderful presentation. I certainly will add my
Good.
thanks to that. A question that is here and that I think I'd like to expand on a little bit. Dawn asks, as European settlements grew, what was happening with the native population? And as I touched on briefly in the introduction, our traditional in European American history view of this is that the natives all kind of left and went someplace else.
I want to get back. I want to be able to talk. I want to be able to.
Okay.
Yeah,
you can.
That the natives had all
microphone is off.
left.
You might want to.
Am I?
You need to put
and
this
gone
on
someplace else, and that there wasn't any continuity. Part of this was that there wasn't a paper trail around the transfer of land from natives to Europeans in this area, as there was in some places. Do you want to move on from that and talk about the need to understand continuity of native presence?
Yeah, it's something that we should have been doing a lot better with this historically than we have. And building off of what John was touching on, that what happened to the native, well, nothing happened, to them. They were here, they were always here, and a lot of them stayed here. It's a real complicated answer for a simple question, but there were a lot of factors that were really coming to bear and pushing Native Americans to keep quiet about who they were. They have a very long and bloody history with the English particularly, but other European powers of being hunted and executed brutally. And so, and not only that, being unfairly treated, land taken away, and of course diseases were a huge issue coming into from the very earliest times Europeans showed up in the North American continent. Waves and waves of epidemic disease really took a toll on the indigenous people in the Americas. And in this area, yeah, they have the saying, we've been hidden in plain sight, meaning that they've always been here, but they might not be so vocal in past generations about admitting or telling people or letting it be publicly known that they had indigenous ancestry. And for good reason, for some of the reasons that I already mentioned. And it just wasn't safe for that to be known about them. They could be, at best, they could be discriminated against, and at worst, they definitely could be killed for being indigenous. And recently in the news, I'm sure a lot of people have heard about, they're just starting to recover some of the history from the schools, the state school, or schools in Canada, federal schools in the United States, the Indian schools that were supposed to take the Indian out of them and make them civil and social and acceptable. And that is also a very painful and traumatic experience for a lot of people. And this, the trauma, that cumulative trauma that has come to bear on them. Understandably, you can see why people wouldn't let it be known that they were indigenous, but they've always been around, and they've always held on to their traditions and their stories, and all of that stuff. It might not have been written down, but it stays alive in the oral traditions that they have, and also in this concept that we were talking about tonight that Rich Holshoe and Chief Roger Longtoe Sheehan supplied for us tonight, this concept of the connection to these places. Like in Bellows Falls, they still are very connected to that place in Bellows Falls in and around the petroglyphs. You know, just because we as Europeans or white people weren't aware of it doesn't mean it wasn't still going on and part of their culture and life. It just wasn't something we were aware of. But hopefully that's you know, we're starting to have conversations about it and people have questions about it and want to know. And I think that's a good example of how maybe that's starting to change.
I see Dwayne's hand in the air electronically. Dwayne?
Yes. Thank you, Gail. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you for doing this presentation. I have an archaeological question local. From the creation of the island from around 1800 to the present, over the years, have there been any professional archaeological digs on the island?
There was one, one in the early 2000s. As I recall, they didn't turn up a whole lot because the island itself has just been so dug up and chowdered with mill buildings and railroad stuff and roads. And honestly, there really isn't much land on that area that hasn't been either filled or dug up itself and disturbed, or honestly had a lot of toxic chemicals poured onto it or into it. When they were tearing down the Robertson paper mill a few years ago, they did have an archaeologist on hand who was monitoring the demolition as they got below grade. You know, they took the building part down and then they had to remove some of the building that went down into the soil. And so they had an archaeologist on site during that just to monitor it, to make sure that they weren't uncut or that they weren't, disturbing any obvious archaeological sites when they were doing that. Because of course that whole area, if you've looked through any of the Bellows Falls history, that area is noted for having had a lot of indigenous burials turn up over the years. And so that's one of the things that they were primarily concerned about, is making sure that if there were still burials intact when the Robertson was coming down, that they were aware of it, that they were going to and address it, but they didn't find any as it turned out.
Well, based on that information, where the island house was located across the street from there, it wasn't developed much over the years, and there's still land there, except for the power institution that's there.
Mm-hmm.
But that land hasn't really been developed that much, and I didn't know if that area has been looked at for archaeological digs.
That I don't know. Because it's owned by the power company, it's their responsibility to look into that. And they would have records on that, but I don't know if that spot where the power company owns right there on the top, if they've actually done excavations there. And that spot has been not a lot. I mean, relatively speaking, not as much has been done there as in other parts of the island, but early on, there were, when the power company stuff went in the 1920s, that stuff was also that's sort of when that started to be developed more. And back then they really weren't paying any attention. Like that wasn't even a concept to do archaeological excavations back then when they were installing some of that stuff. But I don't know. I'm not sure. There probably are records with the power company, but they probably wouldn't tell you, I would imagine.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Tricia Miller puts in the chat a plug for Nathaniel Philbrick's book, Mayflower.
Mm-hmm.
Which has quite a bit in it about the introduction of diseases by very early European settlers. It is primarily about southern New England, but some of these same things affected us. I would also mention in the same connection, David Silverman's book, This Land is Their Land, which goes into even more detail on particularly the history of the Plymouth colony and the Pilgrims and the Mayflower and all that stuff, looked at through native through the eyes of the indigenous people who lived in that area. As I say, neither of those touch on our area, and I really think this whole question of contact, while it has been studied somewhat, is still an area for a great deal better understanding in our part of the New England landscape.
Mhm. Yes.
Yeah, I would
I have a
agree that
question.
oh, go ahead.
I just wanted to offer or ask a question about the petroglyphs and its place in the larger landscape, if you will, of this extraordinary space with, I believe, what is one of the narrowest parts of the Connecticut River outside of the Connecticut Lakes region. Very narrow, very turbulent falls, extraordinary backdrop with Fall Mountain to the east, with the terraces to the west, and the way that the river meanders down, a very important fishing place, habitation space, burial space. Why are the petroglyphs there? Are they part of this landscape? And what is that all about, if I may throw that out?
Well, again, I'll give you the archaeologist's perspective on that, and that's just one of. It would be great if Rich is here, he could certainly chime in on this for sure, or Roger. For what? First of all, the petroglyphs themselves are really remarkable and unique. There are only 2 sets of petroglyphs on the entire Connecticut River Valley, and given that, that's rare, and having petroglyphs at all is very rare. Having 2 sets of petroglyphs within 30 miles of one another is also exceedingly rare. And the fact that they're both actually showing similar but different, are depicting similar but different scenes is also very interesting. And it just gives you an idea of, again, like with all of the other things that you mentioned about Bellows Falls or that particular spot, you've got the narrowing of the river right at that spot. It's the longest set of falls on the river. It's not the highest set of falls, but it's the longest set of rapids, more or less, along the falls there. The petroglyphs are situated right at the base of that, so I don't think that that's an accident. You also have it situated right at the edge of the river, at the base of the mountain, right where the mountain comes down to that intersection, that confluence, if you will, as Rich said, of where the mountain comes down, and at the base of the falls, you've got the petroglyphs right there. And we've got burials. We've got well-documented burials right behind that, right up. We were just a couple questions ago, we were talking about the island and the island house and excavations up there. That's where some of the burials are, right up behind the petroglyphs. And again, in this situation, if we look at just one thing, that's interesting. If we start to look at 2 things, that's makes it a little more interesting. We start to look at the whole totality of all of the things in and around the petroglyphs in Bellows Falls, right there at that spot. It's absolutely unusual, and the evidence is overwhelming that it's a significant spot for Indigenous people. I'm not sure that there's, at least I can't speak to exactly what that specific importance would be, other than I can say that it's marking something. You know, we put up signs to mark important places all the time, and it's way more than that. I'm not just saying that petroglyphs are just, a sign that says park here or something like that, but the fact that there is something written, that there is something carved, there's some that took effort and took planning and some idea behind that, why that somebody wanted, or many people probably over generations, carved these things into the stone right there, is really unique and special. And when we strip away all of the modern stuff that's there now, that sort of clouds our view and makes it a little bit difficult to focus on how beautiful and special that spot is. Again, focusing in on that historic landscape, contextualizing the petroglyphs in their time and space. Wow, it just blows your mind about what it could mean. Knowing what it definitely does mean, but what else it could mean is really enticing and exciting. And why we don't celebrate that more in town, I don't know. I think that's something that we're working on trying to fix that, I know. But, you know, thinking about that, like, why isn't that, you know, as exciting to us as the old mills that aren't there anymore?
Thank you.
In the chat, I notice a comment by Martha Pinello, who adds to the list of books, and we could go on and on with that. Robert Goodby's book, A Deep Presence, which is a recent publication telling the continuing indigenous presence in the Monadnock region. I would presume it draws on some of the work that you showed us illustrations of. And
yeah, that picture from Greenland was from that book. So yeah, if you want to get a grasp of the local archaeology and indigenous history, that's a great book, because he talks about archaeology in that too, and uses those examples from right here in the Monadnock region in the Connecticut River Valley to tell the story. Probably way better than I did, so it's worth the money, I think.
Are there other questions? Yes, I see. Tricia Miller's hand is in the air electronically.
This is her husband, David.
Okay.
So a little slightly different voice here. I was just thinking that Tricia and I have lived out west, and we visited many sites that were petroglyph sites, like Three River petroglyphs in New Mexico. And I'm just wondering if there's a lot of petroglyphs out there that were used like as communication, I believe, like with newspaper rock. There's one that a rock, flat surfaced rock that's just completely covered with petroglyphs. And I'm just wondering if maybe the reason there's not many on this East Coast is because it was not communicating, the communication wasn't as much because they had more going up and down the river, and so there was more interaction between the two. I just don't know. Just a question.
Yeah, it's hard to say. Of course, the environments are very different from what's going on out west to what we have going on here, and I'm sure every example has its own backstory as to exactly why its function and what everything means there. Also from where the rock, or where the carvings, petroglyphs are in right there in Bellows Falls, it's also a place where you'd have to get out in portage. You couldn't navigate those falls. And so part of it might have to do with, this is a place where you would have to go by, you would have to pass, you would have to travel up and around. That would be, like you said, maybe a way to tell people that this is the way you go. Although if you've ever seen the petroglyphs, you actually see them looking down. You wouldn't see them from the river. So there's also something to be said for the fact that they're there perched right at the base of the falls, and the Abenaki have a cultural any place where waters are very turbulent, there are a lot of dangers inherent in that, and there are a lot of tribal stories and a lot of tribal histories that talk about turbulent waters being places that are passages essentially between worlds. So you have the living world and the underworld. I'm probably not getting those terms correctly, but any places where there's churning water are places where you can pass from one to the other. And the idea being that you can shaman or people who are medicine people who would go into trances and need to communicate with ancestors and things like that might come to these spots where the water is turning. Rich and Roger bring that point up, that any places where these sorts of energies come together are very important and they're very spiritual. And so it has something, it certainly has something to do with that as a spiritual place for people to either meditate or come into communication with other worlds, or the idea that their spirits would pass into other worlds. Yeah, again, I'm trying not to speak too much on their behalf in regard to that kind of stuff, but this is just sort of based on what they have told me.
Well, thank you.
Peter Bergstrom puts in the chat, Google Maps now has the correct location of the petroglyphs. They used to show up on the square, but on the top of the steep slope above them, there are now no signs showing where to look for them. I might add to that there was a small sign for a long time that pointed to, I believe it pointed to quote unquote Indian carvings. I think we've probably worked a little beyond that. And I think there is now and will be, I think, for some time, ongoing discussion that must involve our Abenaki neighbors about how to mark them, how to attract people to them, or how perhaps not to attract people to them. This is not there's not a simplistic answer to this, and good historic preservation takes into account the really hundreds of years probably of meaning of the site. And doesn't do so casually. I would be a little reluctant to have our Historic Preservation Commission recommend putting up a big neon sign pointing everybody to them.
Yeah, plus it's really dangerous to go
yes,
hang yourself over the edge. It's very
the people are really not encouraged for that reason alone to sort of climb down the cliff.
Yeah, I don't think you'd do very well if you lost your footing.
There is, and we could go on into this, a long and not particularly proud history of people marking them, recarving some of them, painting them over, and so on. I think the DAR had some to do with some of that, but we're getting beyond that. Larry? Unmute yourself. There you are.
Yep. I just wanted to mention that on the petroglyphs, I happen to have a original photograph print from around the 1910, possibly 1915 era, before they were recarved prior to the opening of the Bellows Bridge. Very, very, very similar to what is there now. It does look like they were just simply deepened a little bit and not completely erased. One thing that I don't know what happened to was some years back, there was a LiDAR image of that whole rock ledge area. And if I remember correctly, there was discussion that they had found additional images that had not been recarved, but were, they did show up on that level. That would be kind of a nice thing that, you know, if a copy of that could be made available either at the library or on display somewhere, but I really haven't seen any place where that could be. One, you mentioned the safety part. Last time I was down that area, I did notice that there was a good sized hole developing outside of the fence line, more or less behind the retaining wall. So you're right, it's getting to be very hazardous in that general area. And finally, with the funding and so forth and the excitement about New Hampshire might really, really, really do something, as far as the Bellows Bridge. It's not too early to document and try to figure out some plans. If that bridge gets rebuilt, I'm sure that the abutment that was done in the 1930-ish timeframe probably would not be sufficient for today's standards. And the protection of those petroglyphs would, really needs to be looked at. I'd hate to see us revert back to the days of dynamite. But
Yeah,
I'm sure that,
it's the site is on the radar of the state archaeologists and a number of other groups. So I'm still, if New Hampshire does something about that bridge, I'll believe it when I see it. But you're right, it doesn't hurt to get the plan in place ahead of time. Usually with historic preservation stuff, it's after the fact. But
exactly.
yeah.
New Hampshire simply wants to make the Vilas Bridge into an archaeological site. I was led to understand when extensive work was done on rebuilding and repositioning Route 12 on the New Hampshire side of the river, that additional petroglyphs were found. Larry, you may know something about that, or Gail, you might, and that they were intentionally not publicized or advertised as to their exact location.
Yes, that's my understanding as well. And I've seen some images that allude to that's what they might be, is of that side of the river. Someone had donated some things to the Historical Society that I thought were faked, drawn in chalk. But then I found the exact same images somewhere else, which reflected back to those were what had been discovered over on the North Walpole side. And interestingly enough, as I understand it, they face in the same direction. So they're facing Fall Mountain. So instead of the carvers facing the river, the carvers are facing Fall Mountain. And I don't know that that means much. And I believe also that, if I recall correctly, there's, I think, one head and one axe or hatchet type of thing, and one other image. I don't remember now off the top of my head what it was, but different, a little bit different. And I've heard rumors that there were even more that got reburied, but who knows?
I'm interested in your comment that the ones on the New Hampshire side of the river are so positioned as to face, that would be eastward. And I have heard speculation anyway that the orientation of the existing ones facing either the sunrise or the mountain may have significance, but that's speculative, of course.
And one thing I'll just bring up as far as some of those other petroglyphs that I think have turned up, not just in and along the river, but in other parts of the Monadnock region, I wouldn't say that they were fakes, but they're not original, they're not indigenous. A lot of times things like tomahawks and bows and arrows that tend to turn up are not what indigenous people would have carved. They are what white people think of when they think of like a typical indigenous person, a Native American. They think bows and arrows and hatchets and tomahawks and things like that, but that's not what would be carved. The faces that we have in Bellows Falls, those are very, very typical of what you would find for true Native American petroglyphs. And the ones down in Brattleboro, there's a face there, but then they also have animal symbols down there too, which is also in keeping with that. So it's exciting to think that there might be more, but I would just caution people not to get not to get too carried away, because there are a lot of copies, and we know from the history just of the petroglyphs and the real petroglyphs themselves that people added things to them over the years and recarved them. So there is a tradition of carving stuff in that area, in and around those petroglyphs too. So not that people were trying to necessarily do anything bad or wrong, but they wanted to carve something too, probably, and or be sneaky about it. But yeah, that's part of studying the whole thing and getting all of the information that we can, and then starting to be able to pick apart, well, this is, this makes sense, this one doesn't quite make sense. It's all part of pulling that information all together. And it's because it's New Hampshire and Vermont, there's source materials in different places, and so it gets a little bit difficult sometimes to make sure you're all dealing with the same thing at the same time with historic records too.
Any other questions? This has been wonderful. As has been mentioned, the Historic Preservation Commission is busily working on what I think is going to be a very exciting effort to try to put our town's history in the context of the millennia of occupation here, and I think we'll be hearing more about it.
Thank you, everybody, and thanks for all the great questions and sticking through to the end.
Thank you, Gail. Very wonderful presentation.
Thank you.